Before You Go to Egypt, You Should Know by Eli, Kyla, Jordan, and Eli. If you are planning a holiday to Egypt, there are some things you may want to know about the history of ancient Egypt and the way of life of the different classes during that time. This documentary will provide you with that information. It will also help you learn about the most important tourist destinations and archaeological sites. This video also includes useful information about the mummification process and other interesting topics. Having this background information will help you have a great vacation to Egypt. Nobles, unlike most Egyptians, had a luxurious, easy life. Being part of the pharaoh's family, or the top echelon of society, nobles had almost everything they could want. They had lots of wealth, including a proto-currency called deben, nice homes, free time to socialize, fine linen raiment, jewelry, perfume, great food, entertainers, and grandiose, extravagant parties. Nobles had a range of jobs, from advising the pharaoh on matters of national security and war to collecting taxes. Nobles also created giant monuments which draw tourists to this day. These tourist destinations include the Pyramids of Giza, the Karnak White Chapel of Sanuset I, Karnak, Hatshepsut's Mortuary Temple, and Abu Simbel. Probably the most well-known of these 5 Egyptian must-see destinations are the Pyramids of Giza. The pyramids were built to hold the bodies of the deceased pharaohs. The 3 largest pyramids were built for the pharaohs Menkaure, Khafre, and Khufu. The Pyramids of Giza are important archaeological sites because they help us learn about ancient Egypt, like what the pharaohs ate, how they lived, what possessions they had, how advanced the culture was, and more. Another great Egyptian travel destination is the Karnak White Chapel of Sanuset I. The White Chapel was built as part of the Sed Festival celebrating Pharaoh Sanuset I's 30th year as ruler. This chapel is a very important archaeological site because the inscriptions in the temple have information of geographical and historical importance which help archaeologists trace the role of Amun in Karnak. The huge temple complex of Karnak. This site was started in the 18th century BCE and added on by virtually every pharaoh of the dynasty. Karnak temples were built for religious purposes, usually to honor the god Amun-Ra. Karnak is an incredibly important historical site because it sheds light on the religious life of the Egyptians. Another important tourist site is Hatshepsut's Mortuary Temple. This temple was built to commemorate Hatshepsut's achievements and to serve her as a funerary temple as well as a sanctuary for Amun-Ra. Her mortuary temple is important because it provides detail about Egyptian trade. The last incredible tourist destination is Abu Simbel Temples. Abu Simbel was made by Ramses II to impress and intimidate Egypt's southern neighbors and reinforce the Egyptian religion in the region. It was also built to express Ramses II's ego and pride. Abu Simbel is important because, among other reasons, it contains Nefertiti's temple, one of 2 temples in Egypt dedicated to a woman.
Hello, I've been told about your upcoming stay in Egypt. As a highly trained professional priest, I will be willing to help you. In ancient day Egypt, priests were highly respected and very important. They're the 3rd highest rankings after the pharaohs and the nobles. Priests had many significant jobs, including embalming, taking all the organs out of the body and cleaning the body. They were also in charge of temples and taking good care of them, and they oversaw all religious ceremonies. Giving advice to the pharaohs and performing healings was another job priests performed. Depending on their rank, priests were treated with more or less respect. The high priests, those who gave the pharaohs advice, were normally highly respected and were from a well-esteemed family. Egyptians believed in life after death, so they mummified dead bodies, thinking that all thoughts came from the heart and not the brain. Embalmers took out all the organs except for the heart, so that they could think in the afterlife. The first step in the process of taking all the organs out of the body is removing the brains. Next, they took out all the organs except for the heart. Then the inside of the body was packed and cleaned with scented resin. After 40 days, the body was washed and dried out. Lastly, the mummy was treated with perfume and molten resin before being wrapped for burial. During this process, there was one important thing the priests had to do. Egyptians believed that all good and bad deeds were stored in the heart. Before going to the afterlife, the person's heart would be weighed against the God of truth, Ma'at. If the heart did not pass the test of Mut, the devourer god would swallow them. The heart weighed the same or less than the feather of Mut, the person and the heart would live forever. In order for the priests to keep the organs, they had to make things called canopic jars. Canopic jars were used to store the lungs, the stomach, the liver, and the intestines. The lungs were stored in a jar with the head of a baboon named Hapi. The stomachs were stored in a jar with the head of a jackal named Dumutep. The liver was stored in a jar with the head of a human named Amesity, and the intestines were stored in a jar with the head of a falcon named Kebasna. These are the four sons of Horus. In the afterlife, they had minions to help them. To help them, the Egyptians in the afterlife had Shabatis. They were put around the sarcophagus to be their minions in the afterlife. Most Shabatis were very small, and there were more than one of them. Rarely Shabatis were big and larger. They were believed to be magic and work for the dead, as substitute laborers in the field of Osiris. Thank you for coming to see my priest part of the exhibit.
The life of a scribe is an important role in Egypt. Scribes were Egypt's official writers and record keepers. Scribes were well paid and highly respected. Most scribes worked for the government, but some worked for nobles. But all scribes were the same, in a way, like that only men were allowed to be scribes. Scribes were the people who created hieroglyphics, the Rosetta Stone, and the Rhind Papyrus, even writing for religious purposes. When you were a scribe, you can rise above social class. And if you're a legal scribe, you could record court cases and collect taxes. So, if you see a scribe, you should take a photo of the scribe. So, scribes were the people who created hieroglyphics, and they were the first to write them. Boys who were going to school to be a scribe had to stay in school for 12 years or more. Scribes also made the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is a stone seal with inscribed writing on it. The Rosetta Stone had writing on it, and it shows how much changed since the Pharaohic times. They also wrote the good deeds that the king does for the temples, called the decree. Decrees like this were usually set up by the king. Decrees like this were inscribed stones 3 times in Egyptian, Demotic, and Greek. Scribes attempted to approach math. The Rhind Papyrus shows what the Egyptians did to approach math. Scribes were expected to undertake tasks. This must have demanded some math as well as writing skills. Scribes would write for religious purposes. Scribes would write for religious purposes because they liked to praise their gods, and some scribes would write for religious purposes for ceremonies or big celebrations for their gods. In both ways, the scribes would write for religious purposes because
What would all the nobles, priests, scribes, and artisans do without peasants? The peasants grew food, built pyramids, and were their workers. Without them, where would they get all that? The peasants had simple lives, easy enough to understand. You had a family, farmed, tried to have food on the table, and tried not to go broke and not be beaten. Family life in ancient Egypt for peasants was very simple. The farmer farmed, the wife made clothes, cooked and cleaned, and the children helped with the farming or the cleaning. A typical farmer in ancient Egypt usually had these crops. Grain was the first crop they do after flooding season. Once the grain was harvested, they grew vegetables such as onions, leeks, cabbages, beans, cucumbers, and lettuce. Animals that the Egyptians had helped you with jobs like trampling the seeds, pulling your plow, eating unwanted grain or wheat, and providing you with food and drink. But having these animals may have caused misfortune, like if your donkey nibbled on somebody else's crops, the farmer could threaten to take you to court. Also, if your animals were sick, you had to do all the work that they did. You also had to take great care of your animals. You had to give them food, drink, and had to count your cattle. Taxes were also imposed on crops, which if you had a very bad crop one year and could not pay the taxes, you would unfortunately have to get brutally beaten. Grain, mostly wheat, was a stable crop of life in ancient Egypt. As a result of a few grazing lands and the expensive meat, most peasants lived off of a diet of bread, beer, and also onions, cucumbers, fish, bread, peas, and lentils. Usually the farmer and his family grew all this themselves, but if they couldn't, they would usually exchange it with their neighbors. Well, after they all grew it, then the people in the higher classes would take all the good food and leave them with whatever was left over. The Tomb of Meketra contains 25 wooden models explaining all sorts of aspects of the life of Meketra. There are model houses along with granaries and cattle sheds, so Makatra would be well provided with shelter and food. The latter was prepared in model breweries, bakeries, and butcher shops. There were also workshops where the carpenters and weavers provided a permanent supply of manufactured goods. Makatra owned a number of boats, including fishing boats, skiffs, formal barges, and even a kitchen boat. He would need all of these in the afterlife, especially to make the pilgrimage to Abydos.
With the information you just learned, you will be much better informed on your trip to Egypt. For instance, when you see a mummy, you will know how the body inside was mummified. You will also know where to visit, destination's importance, and its background information. With your new knowledge of Egypt, you will even know a little bit about Egyptian math on the Rhine papyrus. Finally, you will know how the different classes lived in ancient Egypt and more. Good luck on your trip!